Hi, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about the social impacts of World War II at home. Specifically, I want to talk to you about how African Americans, Mexican Americans, and how Japanese Americans were affected by the war. Keep in mind, this is a question that AP loves to ask, kind of the effects on the home front. Those aren't the only three groups that you can talk about. If you ever got a question like that, you could also talk about women, like Rosie the Riveter, inspiring women to go into the workforce, and just how everyday Americans were impacted through rationing and so forth. But Ms. Schacht is talking about those in her video. So I just want to focus on those three groups that I mentioned. So let's start with talking about how African Americans were affected. African Americans in the military and defense related jobs were very, very segregated. If you were working, many African Americans worked in the defense industries, doing things for the war effort, and a lot of times they suffered from less pay compared to their white counterparts or wouldn't be allowed to work on the factory floor. And then in the military, too, they would be relegated to, you know, they'd be working in segregated divisions in the military, and as well as more like supporting roles in combat, like a cook or grave digging duty, something like that. And so, with the outbreak of World War II, as Americans were committed to, stopping fascism abroad, it became obvious that there was a juxtaposition that, hey, there's racism going on at home. I mean, we're trying to end like Nazism and white supremacy overseas. How can we reckon with that? And so that was brought to people's attention thanks to a predominantly African American newspaper that was very influential called The Courier. They actually published a letter by a Black defense worker in Kansas, and it kind of ignited this movement that's going to be called the WWII campaign. Because in it, like I said, it kind of pointed out that, juxtaposition, that how could we be fighting for the ending fascism and making sure that white supremacy didn't exterminate the Jews, for instance, and yet not treating everyone fairly at home. So this expression of double V, victory abroad and victory at home, really began to stick thanks to this newspaper kind of making it their campaign. And it went on that they would kind of publish things like this for over a year, just calling attention to this necessity and kind of calling on Blacks, like what we see in this propaganda poster by the government, to be patriotic and to do their war effort. But as you can see in the photo up above, also to support this double V campaign. Altogether, about 1 million Blacks served in the military during World War II. Another 6 million Blacks actually helped out in important defense-related jobs during World War II. And this was an important step in trying to raise awareness of the racial injustices that were going on, and this will be picked up by the civil rights leaders of the 1950s and 60s after World War II. The next group I want to talk to you about are Mexican Americans. If you recall from the Great Depression, they were kicked out in large part of the United States as there was threats over job competition. The United States realizes that we need those Mexican workers, those farm workers back. And so we start the Bracero program. Bracero means manual labor in Spanish. And this Bracero program, again, is going to do the opposite of repatriation that was in the 1930s. It is now going to have a process for bringing back these Mexican agricultural workers. This will become the largest guest worker program in United States history. Again, it was started in the midst of World War II. It was meant to just be temporary and last maybe through the end of the war, but it actually ended up going on until 1964. The program actually guaranteed the Mexican workers some basic protections like a minimum wage, insurance, safe housing, and so forth. Unfortunately, though, a lot of times the Braceros, the workers did not get everything that was promised to them. Sometimes they had to wait for their wages to be paid for them or fight for them to get them at all and live in substandard housing and things like that. So no surprise, there were also a lot of strikes at this time. Altogether, there are about 4.6 million contracts that were issued over the 22 years of this Bracero program. Here you can see that it was not easy for the Bracero workers. The Bracero worker pictured on the left actually had a short hoe, which ended up actually being outlawed in many states today, but it required really back-breaking work instead of a longer tool. And as you can see by the sign on the right, they faced a lot of racism and discrimination, the Mexican workers here in the United States. But this kind of set the precedent for kind of a major migration shift that we would have Mexican Americans, crossing the border to work in the United States, and then sometimes taking that money and, going back, that was all part of the agreement. So that is how Mexican Americans are affected by the war. And this shows you just in total kind of how many workers. It's a little blurry, but you can see that's in the thousands and gets up into almost 500,000 in 1 year. This next group I want to talk to you about was the worst affected by the war, I would argue, and that is Japanese Americans. This all started with, actually even before Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans had been targeted, and there was some concern that there might be spies in the United States, and the government actually even did some investigation on that. But Pearl Harbor happened, and people, even though the government had said that, hey, there isn't anything to be concerned about with these Japanese Americans living in the United States, the American public still was incredibly suspicious. And so with that, on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066, which is going to require the Japanese Americans to move out of their homes because there was worries of them helping the enemy, being spies, and so forth. Again, this is going to affect the lives of almost 120,000 people that are now going to be forced to leave their homes and their jobs and now move to these internment camps. About 2/3 of those 120,000 were actually full-born citizens, actually raised in the United States. But that didn't matter. People were so on edge after Pearl Harbor that they, allowed this to go on. At first, if we go back, you can see at first the Japanese Americans were taken to these, the picture on the right shows that they were taken to these relocation centers. They a lot of times had like less than 6 days to pack up all their belongings, whatever they could get. Then they'd be taken to these relocation centers. Their luggage and so forth would be inspected. And then they would live in these really poor living conditions, sometimes just in like a horse barn. From there, then they'd be transported to one of these 10 more permanent relocation centers. As you can tell, most of them are on the West Coast because that's where predominantly the Japanese Americans were living. Again, it turned out that none of these Japanese Americans, ended up being spies, but now they are forced to live in these camps for years. And you can see an overview of the barracks at one of these camps. Families would be living with other families. There was no privacy. Here you can see in the top some families waiting for their housing assignments. And here you can see they'd be fed food, but again, you're still, essentially in jail as there are soldiers walking around making sure that you don't leave. And this went on for basically 3 years. What else do I want to tell you? Oh, so the next slide shows us that there was a famous case that is actually a Quizlet term, Korematsu, a Japanese person sued over this, saying that, of course, it violated his Fifth Amendment rights. He lost the case, and so the Supreme Court basically validated the internment camps that had been going on for several years at that point. Ultimately, like I mentioned before, this was, you could argue, blown out of proportion as there was not any spies in these camps, and it uprooted these people's lives for years. Decades later, in 1988, Congress actually issued a formal apology for this and even, in fact, paid back some money, some reparations for the families of these Japanese internment camp survivors. So those are the three groups that I wanted to focus on. Make sure you understand again how African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Japanese Americans were impacted by the war. But you could also remember, if you ever had an SAQ or LEQ, DBQ, bring in women talking about Rosie the Riveter and even everyday Americans and so forth. But these are at least three specific groups. All right. Hope that helps, guys. Have a great rest of your day.